only 2011, we've already produced 9 titles, including Rethinking Chineseness, Transnational Sinophone Identities in the Nanyang Literary World by E.K. Tan, Confucian Prophet, Political Thought, and Dufu's Poetry by David Schneider, A Study of Two Classics, A Cultural Critique of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and The Water Margin by Liu Zaifu, a very famous Chinese literary critic, Gao Xingjian, the Nobel laureate, Aesthetics and Creation. We had a special event with him at the Modern MLA conference last year. The Classic of Changes in Cultural Context, A Textual Archaeology of the I Ching by Scott Davis. Gao Xingjian's and E.K. Tan's books have already earned high praise in journal reviews. Gao Xingjian's book was recommended for being beautifully produced, carefully edited, and highly engaging and readable. E.K. Tan's book was lauded because it is well written and researched and makes important contributions to Sinophone studies, Chinese studies, and Southeast Asian studies, as well as to scholarship on diaspora, comparative literature, and world literature. So all the books that are produced in this series have to go through very rigorous peer review, and they're getting good journal reviews. So I'm very, very pleased with the way this series is progressing. So now I'd like to introduce a new book that's coming out. I'll be introducing several new books that are coming out this year. And this is by the translator Ross King, who is sitting right next to me. The title of the book is Infected Korean Language, Purity versus Hybridity, from the Sinographic Cosmopolis to Japanese Colonialism to Global English. You can see it covers a huge amount of territory, but it's dealing with sinographic. And the reason I wanted it in my series is because it's dealing with the Sinosphere, which is the written form of Chinese language in the way it affected East Asia. So I thought it was a good book to have in the series. Mark Arlen Peterson of Brigham Young University has praised the book, stating that this is a wonderful work in an overlooked area. The scholarship is brilliant, innovative, and highly specialized. One must be well prepared in modern Korean, pre-modern Korean, and Chinese to undertake such a task. This is a real masterpiece. So I'd like to now introduce Ross King, who is Professor of Korean Studies and head of the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia, UBC, in Vancouver, Canada, to talk about this book and the genesis of the book.
Thank you very much. I'm a little embarrassed to be in this company because the book is about Korean, and the book is a Sinophone series, and I'm certain that many of my Korean red-blooded nationalist Korean colleagues are offended that this book has appeared in this series. But I can defend it for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm also embarrassed because it's actually not my work. I'm simply the translator, and my job has been to bring into English what I thought was a really important work, and then to write a critical introduction that contextualizes the book better for an Anglophone readership. And part of the problem here is that there's actually very little available in English, or in Korean for that matter, that treats it in a theoretically sophisticated way, the way that Korean has experienced what I would call linguistic modernity, moving away from a system where literary Sinitic was the main written language, and then vernacularizing into the 20th century with Korean as their main written language. There are really, literally only 2 really decent books worth reading. One by Lee and Ramsey, another by Lee Sang-ok, translated also with Bob Ramsey. These are very linguistic-y works, and there's very little in the way of cultural and social history of language and writing in Korea that's available in any language, and I include Korean here because Korean scholarship in South Korea is also very compartmentalized. So I wanted to bring into English this really exciting work about the politics of language and writing and the history of that politics, as well as a work that engages what I call, or what might be called, language ideology in Korea, and that was written at a time before the field of language ideology really even had congealed in English scholarship. And so it was really language and ideology avant la lettre by this particular author, Mr. Ko. One of the questions that Tony asked me to address was, how is this book different and important? So first of all, Mr. Ko, whose book I translated, is not a scholar. He's actually better known as a writer of fiction. And so he's a very accomplished writer in Korean, but he happened to do all of his PhD work as a PhD student at La Sorbonne in France in comparative historical linguistics, and so approaches the idea of language writing, language history, writing history, with a writer's sensibility, but also having a proper training in historical linguistics. So it's linguistically sophisticated, it's literarily polished, and then what I simply did was to add a critical introduction, which helped position this work, written in the late 1990s, within the scholarship in the last 10 to 15 years around issues of language ideology, linguistic modernity, the work of Lydia Liu, other questions of how languages like Japanese, modern Chinese, have then sort of gotten away from classical literary Sinitic. In terms of what's unusual in terms of discoveries in this book, I think that I would like to think that my introduction contextualizes it in a way that the author himself was not yet aware of. Namely, I mobilize a concept of what I call the sinographic cosmopolis, what Professor Mayer has just referred to as the sinosphere. But in my mind, this particular cultural formation was defined first and foremost by the fact that they used the sinograph, the Chinese characters, as their one and only mode of writing, and how this determined the way that linguistic modernity was experienced in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And so, and this comes out of my reading of Sheldon Pollock's work on what he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, and he has this wonderful book about Sanskrit, or the language of the gods in the world of men, where he makes just a few side comments about what he calls, maybe the sinosphere as well. But the point is that what he says about East Asia is actually woefully uninformed about language and writing in East Asia. And that's not to slam Professor Pollock at all, because he already covers a huge swath of territory and languages. He compares Latinitas with the Sanskrit cosmopolis and throws out all these really interesting questions about what it means to vernacularize, to become a vernacular culture in modernity that I think have not yet been addressed in a comparative way in East Asia. So he throws out really interesting questions, but the sort of answers that he tentatively gives us for East Asia are all wrong. And so I thank him, Professor Pollock, for posing these questions and for, in essence, opening up a new field of comparative research on vernacularization and its origins in East Asia. And I think this book, without the author, Mr. Ko, without realizing it, had actually written a series of essays that were quite useful in starting to think about this question of vernacularization in East Asia. So then the final question that Tony had posed in her email, sort of prepping us for this session, was what about future research possibilities? And I would simply point out that I'm actually now in the middle of a big project looking at the history of language and writing in what I call the sinographic cosmopolis, as well. That involves also the history of linguistic thought, where I would like to think that what is essentially a peripheral part of the sinographic cosmopolis, namely Korea, which has also to this date in Anglophone academia not received much attention because it's really out of the way and also very difficult because you have to learn Japanese, you have to learn Korean, pre-modern Korean. You need to have some familiarity, more than a little, with China to do it, I think that Korea and knowledge of Korea's history in this respect is really important, and therefore Mr. Ko's book was at the very top of my list of things that needed to be translated, and my introduction is meant to contextualize that for the Anglophone readership. Thank you.
Well, the Korean nationalists may not be thrilled to have this book in Cambria Sinophone World Series, but I am. I think it's a wonderful book, and it's really glad that Ross brought it to us. The next book I want to introduce is this green-covered one. It looks like it's got something to do with grass. And it's called The Chinese Prose Poem, A Study of Lucian's Wild Grass, Yecao. So first I'd like to introduce the author of this book, Nick Caldas, who is sitting here. And he is an associate professor of Chinese Studies, director of graduate studies, and program coordinator for Chinese Studies in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University, SUNY Binghamton. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Chinese Cinemas and Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, very active group, MCLC. And he is the literature book review editor for MCLC. I think you're from Ohio, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm from Ohio too. He went to Ohio U and Ohio State, where I have a lot of close connections. So why did I want this book in my series? I mean, people could argue with a lot of the books that well, some of them are squarely in the series, but for others I have to make an argument for why I want them in the series. Well, all I would say is Lucian's my favorite modern Chinese author. And that's enough, but also Lucian interacted a lot with people outside of China, and before there was even the concept of Sinophone, I think Lucian was acting like a Sinophone writer because he drew a lot of inspiration from things outside of China and inspired a lot of things outside of China from within. So I think Lucian deserves to be in my series, and I have no shameful feelings about that. So now I just turn it over to Nick to say why he wrote this book and what it accomplished.
Thank you very much, Victor. So Tony asked me in her email to me to mention quite a few things about Lucian for an audience that might not be familiar with his work. He's by most accounts, the most famous writer of the 20th century in China, and the book Yecao, Wild Grass, is considered perhaps his best or most difficult work. It's been a very daunting field to enter because he's also among the most written about people in Chinese scholarly discourse. And he's part of a very important generation of writers from the early 20th century who were raised and educated in this classical Chinese literature, philosophy, history, all of the traditions, and he was one of the masters, the best students of that tradition. And his generation distinguished themselves by then rejecting that entire tradition and adopting a stance in the early teens and 1920s that has been called radical totalistic iconoclasm by Li Yusheng and others, or rejecting Chinese culture in toto. They felt that China, which was being threatened by aggressor imperialist nations, was at risk of, if the situation continued, of losing its not only territorial autonomy, but experiencing cultural, social, and linguistic extinction. And so they adopted, in response to this rejection of their tradition, and promoted literature as one of the key features to help them counter this threat to China. They felt that literature, especially fiction and poetry, drama, could help create a new Chinese citizen, create a new center for Chinese culture that would make it a viable culture in the 20th century among these other westernized, modernized nations that were aggressors and threats to China. And Lucian and others, they combined Western literary forms with traditional Chinese themes and topics, local language, in Lu Xun's case, not just local modern traditions, but traditional Chinese literature, modern Chinese literature, and